Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to our masterclass. Yes, so my name is Odun Longe. I am co-founder and partner at TLP Advisory. We're a venture law practice. We work with founders and investors across borders. We started out of Lagos, Nigeria about 11 years ago, and now we have offices in London, New York, and Dubai. And our focus, our thesis is we work with African founders, help them enter other markets, and we help people who want to come into the African markets. We help them get on the continent. So that's my pitch. Now, talking about what we're doing here today, it's a master class, so I'm hoping that this will be more of questions. Yes, I have slides. We have slides, but the slides are just to guide us, and it is a backup for if everybody decides not to talk to us. So hopefully we won't need them. So it's a master class on cross-border compliance for African startups, and with a focus on the UK and Delaware, US, which is where most African startups go into. So it's borderless, not lawless. It's a law PR, and I'm sure you're wondering why law and PR. It's a law PR match, but we'll start with the compliance parts, the law part. And yes, first thing is saying that let's not bring anyhowness across the border. So what is anyhowness? The way we do things, the way we do things on the continent, where you can get away with many things, where the result justifies, the end justifies the means, right? The idea is when we're crossing the border, when we're coming in, there's so many processes that it could lead to a nightmare. So here we're speaking more, the perspective here is to be preventive, to avoid getting into those things that might result in fines or a crisis or a reputational damage or you just not being able to scale. So we're looking more from a preventive perspective, starting with the compliance fundamentals, the basic framework, then connecting the dots. Basic framework being the things you need to have in place, the things we make sure you put in place when you come in. And connecting the dots is, what does it look like having, most times what we have is an operational entity on the continent, and then a holding company in the UK or the US. How do you connect the dots in such a way that you're not breaking any compliance obligations, regulatory obligations, and you're keeping with the law, and it helps you scale. Then we talk about how compliance and public relations come together. Maria will do most of that, and then we'll talk about crisis communication in the event that these things do not work out the way we planned, and there is a crisis. Just a few words on how to manage that. So, talking about basic framework when you're moving to when you're crossing the border, most times, so it's from a perspective of a company that started out on the continents, Kenya, Nigeria. You have an operational company, you have a team already, you have probably post-revenue, and then for different reasons, most of the common reasons we see is sometimes it's investor-led, sometimes it's growth, it's product-led. You decide to start an entity in the UK or in the US, mostly Delaware. And so what are the things you should be looking at? What are the things you should be considering when you make this decision? First is the structure. What type of entity are we looking at? There's similar entities across borders. We have the limited liability company on most continents, and that's how most people look to scale. You're looking to have an entity that allows you to do business, that allows you maybe at some point connect both entities or multiple entities, and that gives you the protection from personal liability. In terms of governance, you're thinking, where do I want to have my active board? These are the questions. And I'm just throwing things out here. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or if you have a thought, and let's engage. So in terms of governance, we're thinking board structures. Is the board going to be on your local or your African entity, or is it going to be... So I'm going to start using two words. Saying African entity and has been a mouthful. Holdco and Opco. Okay, so that way I can speak better. So Holdco is the one that's probably in the UK or in Delaware, and your Opco is your operational entity on the continent. So yeah, so where's the governance going to be? Where are you going to have your active board? Is it on the Holdco, or is it in the Opco? What we usually see, what we tend to see is that the Holdco board is the active board, and you have maybe the founders on the Opco, but the Holdco board controls the Opco board, and the Opco board cannot take independent decisions without having the Holdco's buy-in. And this is because more often than not, the Holdco owns the Opco. The Holdco owns all the shares in the Opco, and if that is the case, there's that accountability and that control that stems from the top down. But these are things to talk about, and how do you put that in place, and what reporting arrangements do you put in place? Employee matters. Different countries have different ways, different labor laws, and the degree to which they could be, the degree of enforcement differs. A common thread we see is when companies start going cross-border, they assume you can hire with any entity, but it's very important to bear in mind the right to work. So you have a UK entity because, so Nigeria, there's a Naira issue. A lot of people would rather earn in dollars or pounds. And then you say you will start paying some of your employees in dollars. And then you give them an employment contract from your UK entity or from your US entity, but they don't have a right to work in the UK or the US. You cannot hire someone on the continent that does not have a right to work. Now, you can engage them as a consultant, depending on if really they're a consultant, but these are like the little things that could bite you in the future, and we've seen from experience bite. Now, it's a different case if the person has a right to work, so you can engage people who are residents in these countries and then hire them with your OPCO entity. But you can't hire local staff with your OPCO entity because you want to pay them, but there are workarounds around this. So also, beyond engagement and hiring, what are the minimum requirements? How many leave days? What is acceptable in Kenya? What is acceptable in Nairobi? What is acceptable in London? What are the employee benefits that are compulsory? Those are things you need to think about. Do you want to have the same standard across board? As long as it's a higher standard, it's okay to have the same standard across board, but you cannot go beyond what the law says in every country. Then IP, thinking of intellectual property. Are you looking to protect your IP everywhere you have a presence? And what we typically would advise is, what are your expansion plans? What are your growth plans? What are your market plans? And as a company grows across borders, it might be necessary to have an IP strategy. Are you housing your IP in a single jurisdiction? Some jurisdictions don't allow easy transfer of IP, so common is South Africa. So if you're a South African company that you're looking to go across the border, you now have a holdco, you can't transfer the OPCO's IP just like that. Or like Nigeria and most other countries that you could decide to transfer the IP and then license back. That's not possible in South Africa. So different jurisdictions have the way they deal with their IP assets, and it's just something to bear in mind and have a considered IP strategy as you expand. And that goes with data protection as well. Hello. So data protection as well is something to think about. Data protection compliance is something that is really, it's a big deal now. There are fines. Everyone is giving fines, whether it's EU, whether it's Nigeria. That's the Facebook one that's still ongoing, and Facebook is threatening to leave Nigeria because of the fine, but data protection is a big deal. And there are obligations to think about as you grow and where you have your customers. So it's not just about where do you have entities when you're thinking about data protection. If you're a cross-border business, where do your customers, most of your customers, where are they based? Then you start thinking of the data protection laws in those countries as well. Handling their data information. Fundraising, obviously, when you're looking to fundraise, this is not always the case, but the typical thing we find is you raise into the holdco. You raise using your holdco, and all the investors and all the shareholders sit at the holdco company. The holdco company then owns all the other subsidiaries, regardless of how many subsidiaries or how many affiliates. Now, there are some circumstances where people explore raising per entity. So if you want to target local investors in a certain place, those are things to think about. You may need to carve out and structure that. And if you're raising you also need to look at what kind of investors are you raising from. So for instance, in the UK, if you were going to raise funds in the UK, from UK investors, there are tax benefits. So you're thinking, do I need to register for the EIS or the SEIS? Do I need to register with the HMRC for this? If you're not raising from the UK, from UK investors, you may not need these things. But if you're going to raise from the UK investors, that's something to think about. And you also then, I know most of us on the continent, because more companies, more opcos have Delaware as their holdcos. We're very familiar with the SAFE. We're raising with either equity or SAFE in the early stages, and that's the YC. I'm not going to assume everybody knows that. The SAFE means Simple Agreement for Future Equity. It was introduced by YC. It's a simple way of raising in the early stages. But you can't use a SAFE as it is in the UK. For UK investors, not like you can't use this in the UK, but for UK investors who were seeking to leverage your SEIS, AIS, because a SAFE does not have a guaranteed conversion. It's not sure that it's going to convert, because if the company does not raise equity, it won't convert. But the HMRC tax rebates are based on the fact that you are going to hold shares, and the SAFE does not address that. So these are things to just look at when you're fundraising. Where is your holdco? It's not just everybody does a SAFE or everybody does a convertible note, and then you do that as well. Then before you can start business once you cross the border. And then reporting obligations, reporting obligations with the HMRC, reporting obligations with Companies House. You will be, struck off. In Nigeria, the CAC, for instance, threatens to strike off, but they give you a long time, like 10 years or so before they strike you off. But you get struck off in 2 years. So if you don't, do your annual returns, and if you're not paying attention to your email, it just happens without any involvement from you. Same with Delaware as well. After 2 years, it goes dormant if you don't pay your annual franchise tax. So these are the reporting obligations that you need to think about. And then taxes in general. When you have entities across, you need to think of, this is where transfer pricing comes into place. How are you want to be tax efficient. You want to be tax efficient. How are you paying your taxes? Who's serving what? And the best thing is to get someone in taxes that has that experience across where your entities are, so that they are advising you and helping you be tax efficient. You're not paying double taxes. You're being taxed at in the most optimal jurisdiction. I'm going to stop here now and see if anyone has anything to add or question or to take away. Yes, please.
I can just add two anecdotes to employee matters.
Yes, please.
From Peach Payments, so we're distributed. Thank you. I'm from Peach Payments, so our staff are distributed,
Yes.
but mainly in South.
Two main reasons, tax efficiency and privacy. So Delaware, and for decades now, Delaware has been like the corporate capital in the US. So the laws are already established. It's tax efficient. You pay an annual franchise tax, and then you don't have to pay for operating. You can't even operate in Delaware most times. It's just where you register, and then you only pay your state tax where you operate. In terms of privacy, you don't do filings. You don't have to file in public. So if a Delaware entity, you won't know the directors. If it's not a public company, you can't do a search and then know the directors and the shareholders. So just the privacy, and then it's not tax efficient. And because it's what they've done over years, things are faster, things are more efficient. The courts are fairer. They are more familiar with, not fairer, but the courts are more experienced with commercial transactions and investments. So, yeah. Okay. So the US, you pay state taxes and federal taxes. As a Delaware entity, you will pay annual franchise tax, but those are not your operating tax. Your annual franchise tax will be something similar to an annual returns. It's based on how many shares you have. Now, most African countries that have a Delaware entity are not operating in the country. So the only other obligation you would just have is your federal tax obligations. But if you are operating in other states, you will still have your state's tax obligations. Yeah. Any other question? Yes.
Right. Beyond the limitations, you've highlighted of using SAFE in the UK context, what fundraising instruments do you find most effective for early-stage African startups raising funds from UK-based
investors?
Okay.
That will be the Advanced Subscription Agreements, ASAs. So they're very similar to the SAFE. They achieve the same thing that the SAFE does, but it has a definitive conversion date in the event that there's no, the company does not undergo an equity financing. It also, most ASAs, as long as you're getting it from someone who's familiar with the HMRC obligations, are tailored for the HMRC time bound. So currently, you have to convert within 6 months if you're using a convertible instrument for you to be able to benefit from the EIS and SEIS. So the ASA will have that. So there's a long stop date that's by which time the shares must convert to equity. So the advanced subscription agreements are the better instrument for the UK. Okay, so connecting the dots, how do we put the companies together to flip or not to flip? So there's, in legal speak, we call it flip. And basically what a flip means is if you started an opco on the continent and now you're setting up a holdco, one of the things you need to think of is, am I moving all the shareholders in the opco to the holdco and then making the holdco the owner of the opco? If you decide to do that, it has to be done in a way that is tax efficient. Because when it is not done properly, it could trigger a tax event in that there is some consideration and benefit pattern. So the words matter. So to flip or not to flip, you have to make sure it's an exchange and not a sale or a transfer, but an exchange one for one. So that's what I mean by to flip or not to flip, and just put in the paperwork around that. Capital transfer across entities. You don't just send money, although this is mostly an accounting function. Depending on the country you are, if you're moving capital from outside the country, there's things to get. For instance, in Nigeria, there's a certificate of capital importation. If you want to get certain benefits, you don't have to, you can bring in money directly. But if you want to get certain benefits in terms of when you're repatriating your funds, you want to get that as well. Intellectual property licensing, are you housing the IP in only one entity? And in that case, are the other entities going to enter into licensing agreements? It could be zero royalties or it could be for money. So you might need to put an agreement in place. Intercompany transactions, it is best practice to have an intercompany agreement. So it could be intercompany loan agreement, intercompany services agreement, but basically to document the way you exchange services. The last three are kind of related. So I'm not an accountant, so please correct me if I'm wrong, if I say this wrongly, but there's something called operating on an arm's length basis, an accounting principle that involves operating on an arm's length basis. And even within your intercompanies, your connected companies, the IFRS principle, that's the international blah, 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 requires that all transactions are at an arm's length basis. So you need to document that with an agreement and make sure that your intercompany transactions are properly done. Whatever services, some companies like warehouse, certain functions in just maybe the headquarters, and you might have things like accounting, legal. So how does each subsidiary or each entity pay for the shared services? And then, yes, again, not a tax lawyer, but transfer pricing related to the company agreements. How are you transferring prices transferring costs and taxes across your entities to make sure you're tax efficient? And yeah, so those are the dots you need to think about when you have entities across different borders. Again, any question, comments? Okay. So with that said, yes, you're wondering how public relations and legal are connected. Interestingly, we found ourselves in the same room many times, ourselves and Wimbart, when a client is in a situation and we've come to see that our work, help each other. That when certain things are in place in one end, then it prevents the other, which is why we thought to have this conversation together. So I'm going to be inviting Maria to continue from here.
Thank you so much, Odun. Hello, everyone. Just to get a sense of who's in the room, who's a founder? Founder, investor, operator? You're just here for vibes? Perfect. So one of the things we're strained bedfellows, and as Odun have said, sorry, before I go on, my name is Maria Adediran, and I'm Associate Director at Wimbart. We are an African tech-focused PR agency. We work with investors, VCs, scale-up startups, the likes across the continent. We started off in Nigeria, but grew in markets like Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Rwanda, and my colleague's going to tell me off for not listing more countries. As Odun mentioned, there have been times where we've worked together because oftentimes you've ticked all the boxes, you're ready to move into a new market, but unfortunately, a lot of people only think about the good times and not crisis comms. So I'd like you to take about 10 seconds to think about what would be a really the worst crisis situation for you. So if you were to wake up tomorrow morning and you get a phone call, what would you not want to hear about your company? So you've got 10 seconds. And you're more than welcome to share as well if you feel confident enough. 10 seconds seems really long now. All right. Does anyone want to share? Yep.
A data breach.
I've dealt with those ones. Anyone else? Yep.
Regulator makes a change.
Regulate, yep. And they like to come for the starters, don't they, right? So, what is crisis communications? It's managing a company's reputation. So, TLP, they're thinking about, they aim to win the war in a boardroom, whereas from my perspective, I aim to win the war in the court of public opinion. Now, public opinion is so hard to contain, especially with social media. If someone goes on X and they have a high profile, it's so hard to contain that information altogether. So that means you have to now be prepared and think about your stakeholders. The first one I would say is you need to sustain your investors' confidence. Oftentimes, investors are not aware when a crisis occurs, and then it's out there, and then they start to fill in the box. Fill in the blanks rather. And they start to put out a narrative because I'll tell you now, journalists know who your investors are and they will go to them. And sometimes investors think they are helping, but oftentimes they make it worse. So you have to carry them along the journey. If something is going behind the scenes, before it's made public, speak to the key ones and say, look, this is going on. This is how we aim to rectify it. By carrying them along, they will know how to handle, if, for example, a journalist reaches out to them. Thinking about your crisis comms also helps you preserve market position. I'm sure you all have competitors, am I right? Yeah? And they will take advantage of that. Once they see something is going on, all of a sudden, their marketing, their PR push, you'll see they double down on it because they realize if, for example, your customers are seeing something is going on, whether it's a data breach, for example, they're looking they're looking for the next best thing. And your competitors will be out there telling them that they're the best thing since sliced bread, right? So that's why you have to think about preparing yourself ahead of a crisis situation before it comes public. Ensures business continuity, which is actually also linked to strengthen your stakeholder loyalty. Who are your key stakeholders? It's actually your employees as well, because oftentimes you want them to have confidence in the company, confidence that they are actually still part of a brand that they can trust, right? So if they are not in the known, and I've had experiences where again, just like investors, they think they're helping. No, this is not happening within the company. And they start talking on behalf of the company rather just taking a back seat because they're not aware. And you don't have to tell them everything as long as they know that, okay, it's being dealt with, it's being handled, and they can trust the fact that, okay, I trust in my CEO, I trust in my team, I trust in the leadership as well. And it guides effective decision-making, right? Oftentimes, when it comes to crisis comms, people only consider it during in the midst of a crisis. I've had calls where I've been asked to drop everything, jump on calls, this is the situation, and all of a sudden I have to understand the challenges, I have to put together a holding statement, I haven't spoken to the legal team because we have to review each other's work, and it is a major mess. Whereas if you plan ahead during the good times, think about those crisis comms situation. How am I going to solve it? If you do that beforehand, it will make things a lot easier. Because I'll say this now, the more you scale, the more you grow, the more you attract crisis. It's a good, bad problem, right? So and I've had, So with crisis comms management, it can be summarized in 3 words: anticipate, mitigate, and compensate. Anticipating is seeing things ahead. What could be a crisis comms in my business, a crisis in my business, and anticipating it, because it's great if things are going great now, but you have to actually be open to being like, what actually could be a crisis? And it could be small, it could be large. And that will always develop as you continue to grow and you scale. You mitigate by putting together a playbook which will kind of go through there's a lot more structure in there, but it's understanding what are the processes. Are there packages that you offer, right? So those are some of the things that we'd ask, so that, when we're putting together a statement and someone may not be, you weren't able to contain the conversations internally, at least you've followed all the procedures, so you feel confident enough to put a statement to say, we have done everything right, we're not in the wrong here, this is what we've done, and, things will get better. Reactive messaging. For every single scenario, have a holding statement that once you, in the midst of a crisis, all you have to do is make tweaks here and there and just ensure that it's aligned with the scenario that's taking place. Escalation protocols. Who's your response team? If something were to happen tomorrow, do you know who needs to be in that room or that group call? Does anyone know? No? Yes? But those are the things you need to think about. You need to know PR team, HR team, and you also have to think about time zones, time differences. There have been situations where we're working with a company in the US, and I'm based in the UK. I know 10 p.m. is my bedtime, and there's a certain time where I'll actually be offline. Who is going to pick things up if a journalist in the US reaches out? There must be someone or group of people who are basically the response team to respond, so that when I wake up, there's someone who's briefing me and I can carry on where they've left off. So those are some of the little things that people don't think about. Dedicated contacts. Everyone should be in a WhatsApp group, right? Everyone should know who to reach out to. The first responder brief sheets, right? We go into the meeting, this is how we're going to, this is the situation, this is what we know, this is what we do not know, right? The dark side. And then also red team testing. You test. There's no point having a playbook written down and you haven't tested it to see if it fits our business or if it's applicable in this situation. You test it out, and guess what? In 6 months, you test it again. Don't leave it in the in the back of your library bookshelf. It needs to be tested and refined, and so that everyone's familiar with it as well. So the best crisis comms is those you never read about. And we always say this when we're onboarding clients, we put together a crisis comms template or playbook, and we say we're putting all of this down and we hope to never, ever use it. And that is the best crisis comms. Does anyone have any questions? I think yeah. Any questions? Yes?
Do you have any best practice for how often you should be updating that playbook?
Yeah, so I would say roughly 6 months. If, for example, some people do it 3 months, but then again, you just have to keep refining it. There have been situations, especially when you're dealing with consumers. So customer calls, if you have a call center, for example, your team on the ground, they know the sort of complaints or issues or challenges that your customers are going through, right? So speaking to them regularly, you then know if I need to update this playbook. But I would say no more than 6 months. Any other questions? No? Odun? So the TLP team have a QR code as well, in case is that it?
Yes, we do have a QR code that, Reggie, a QR code if you want to have a chat with us. Thank you. Yes, if you want to have a chat with us, we have a QR code you can scan. There's a form and we'll schedule something. Thank you.
Yeah, and you can always pull me for a chat if you want to discuss crisis comm situations. Maybe you don't want to share with everyone here. Yeah? Yes.
You've done some earlier. But, taking government as a stakeholder in an African nation state, any advice for an innovator, perhaps in the room or in the ecosystem, that comes across a scenario where their innovation is forcing regulation to travel with it, for the benefit of a consuming public, but the citizen may be actively demanding that innovation, but the state is actually concerned about some other consequence of it that may be not in the interest of the state.
Yeah.
How do you, both as lawyer and PR practitioner, come into play to keep the relationship positive, but also to encourage government to open the door to the innovation flourishing?
Yeah, so from a PR perspective, I would say having a government relations person or team who will have constant conversations, who are in the room, who has some sort of influence as well. And fostering those relationships will help in terms of making sure that it's collaborative and you're able to influence them as well and make them see examples. Just giving them regular updates. Look, we've tested this out with a small group of people. This is what we've seen so far, and this is how it benefits you as well. So that's a relationship building and trying to influence, so that also if something goes wrong, you know who you need to, you know who your best buddy is and who can help you navigate that as well.
Yeah. And often innovators don't appreciate that you as a PR business,
Yeah.
as an author, already have existing relationships over many decades with that particular stakeholder. And that particular stakeholder group, let's call it government, is actually quite a complex beast.
Yes.
With multiple agencies, multiple interests, different influences, partisan interests. And actually you can, as an innovator, really rest on those connections and those networks and those influences to contain the scenario and actually see it as a net benefit for both.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, innovators, don't overlook that. Like, really start from scratch, because once you start building, and if you build in silos, that's when you dig yourself a little hole there. Yeah.
Yeah. On a related note, when thinking of your board members, your advisors, you want to have someone with strong government relations connection, especially in your sector. And for as many agencies that have sandboxes in your sector, participate. They're very kind to people that participate in their sandbox, even when they don't know what's happening. And we have a few clients that have participated in sandbox, and they're able to like really push the boundaries with their products. So, yeah.
Well, my question's relatively simpler. And that is, how do you do cross-border crisis communication given the complexities of cultural overtones between? So I'm just thinking specifically, you can imagine Lagos is surrounded, Nigeria is surrounded by Francophone. So just within that context, how would you?
Oh, do you have a specific, like maybe a scenario example that can, that will help bring it?
One of my startups in pharmaceuticals does, drug delivery on demand based on pressing a few buttons. Then they discovered that a certain batch that they had, was not only contaminated, but had been intervened. We still don't know whether it was Singapore or wherever out there. And what they did was they repackaged outdated expired pills into boxes that showed that they were still not expired.
Yeah.
And so it was like, we have to withdraw all of those, we have to tell those, and the whole. And what was discovered is the Yorubas who were speaking on one side of the border were totally different to the je ne comprends pas anglais. On the other.
Yeah.
So it was, how on earth?
Yeah, so I would say, it's an operational challenge there that needs to be resolved. But from a crisis comms perspective is to understand where the issue lies, right? And then you can say, this is how we are doing it to rectify it. So my question to you would be, if I were in a meeting to your team, your portfolio, would be, what are you doing to ensure that this never happens again? Right? And that's what you communicate, because that's what people would want to understand and be like, why should I trust you? If something like this has happened, what are you going to do differently going forward to ensure that that doesn't happen again? Right? And it could be you're hiring a new team to ensure quality control, or you're even changing suppliers, or so they want to understand, okay, this has happened, but this is how, and you can acknowledge it. Sometimes it's best to just acknowledge it and rather than say, oh, no, this didn't happen, because it did, and there's proof points to show that it has. So sometimes it's good to, this is what we're doing to, exactly. It's very, very important. Or even we've partnered with this person to ensure that going forward, we'll ensure that the quality of the drugs that are coming in are the right ones. And then once you relay that, you also have to act on it as well, so that people are actually seeing that, of course. And one of the things I might do is even say, let's go on the likes of CNN, where they can actually, with their cameras, just show the process, because that's a visual storytelling in terms of, we've introduced this new, So that's kind of how to think about it.
So the visual rise above the language barrier.
Yeah, because it's a visual proof point, and that sticks.
But on a very basic level, you would bring to the table both the French-speaking media and the English-speaking media, and contain the story where it gets amplified.
Exactly.
On platforms where other consumers and other stakeholders will obviously hear about the story. So you'd also bring that.
And it will definitely be the local teams as well who will push that narrative as well for you.
Okay, I have a question. So how do you determine the issues to respond to? Because I believe you shouldn't respond to everything.
Not everything, there are times where and this is mostly with social media, it's how much traction is it getting, who's talking about it, but you still prepare just in case. When do we push that button to say we're going to talk about it? Whereas there's some things that there have been issues, some things that might be on, and it's like, if we speak about it, it's going to amplify it, right? But even if there are some small things, crisis situations going on, still react to it in a way that it might be, if it's an employee issue, for example, where you've got a couple of employees or former employees complaining about, the working conditions, for example, and you know that, you've done everything, in terms of the working conditions are right. There's some chatter on social media. An example to react to it without reacting to it is you have an employee spotlight series on LinkedIn where you highlight your employees and, they're talking about how great your company is, or you have like video shoots and stuff like that. Because that's, in some ways, indirectly responding to that. So if I'm seeing something on Twitter down the line, maybe I Google the company, I've already seen other people talking about how great the company is. So I hope that answers your question. Any more? Yeah? Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.